Okay, ladies and gentlemen, very welcome to this, the fifth of the Westminster Faith Debate. Thank you for coming this evening, and we look forward to a very interesting session. The subject is highly topical, the limits of religious freedom. We see issues on a day-by-day basis coming up, whether on the side of London buses or in statements from cardinal archbishops, which relate to these issues. And the purpose of the evening is to inform and elaborate our consideration of these issues. We're very fortunate in that the programme is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Economic and Social Research Council. And they have funded a Religion and Society research programme which has been led by Professor Linda Woodhead at Lancaster University, which has been running for the last 5 years. And the purpose of these events is to present the work which has been done by the participants in that programme to a wider public discussion and response. I think myself it's a tremendous initiative by the research councils and by Linda to ensure that we get some impact of the research that's been done. My name's Charles Clarke. I've had various roles in public life. My one at the moment is I'm a visiting professor in politics and faith at the University of Lancaster, and that's where I met Linda, who's professor at Lancaster, and with whom I have been working. The way that the events will go this evening is that Linda will make some initial remarks about how this discussion can take place. And then she will introduce Professor Peter Jones and Professor Maleiha Malik on her right, who are the two professors who've done the academic work in this area, which they will present. I will then ask our three public respondees, Lisa Appignanesi, Bishop Michael and Rabbi Julie Neuberger, to respond. I'll introduce them in properly when I come to do so. And then we throw it open to the floor. There is a maximum of 10 minutes for every contribution. I have a very nice set of coloured signposts, which in a very polite and helpful way I will brandish at the appropriate moments to remind our speakers that we are working to time. And then when we finish, which I will hope to do just after 7 o'clock, there are drinks afterwards so people can circulate and talk directly to the participants if you would like to do that. There are a couple of other thanks beyond the research councils which I would just like to give before we start. The first is to Lancaster University, which has helped with this, its Faculty of Politics, Philosophy and Religion. Secondly, to Theos, the think tank Theos, particularly Elizabeth Hunter, its General Secretary, who has helped organise this in a whole variety of exciting and interesting ways. And Coexist, a charity which has helped fund the work that we're doing. I need to mention two technical matters. Firstly, all of this is recorded, and you can see the camera at the back, and we put it on the Religion and Society website. So, by the way, you can see the previous discussions in this way if you'd like to do so on the website after this evening. But if you want to ask a question or contribute, you should be aware that that will be recorded and could go out. I don't know if anybody has got an objection to that, but if so, be aware of that at that circumstance. And we also have a highly modern hashtag system if you are twittering, and the hashtag for this is #WFD12, so you know what it is if you want to engage in that. So with that, without further ado, I introduce Professor Linda Woodhead, Professor at Lancaster University, to give a general introduction. Linda.
Thank you, Charles. Well, the debate about religious freedom has always aroused strong passions. Historically, religious people have been subject to intolerance, discrimination and persecution, and have been pioneers in the fight for freedom. That's part of the founding story of the USA, and it explains Americans' passionate commitment to freedom of religion. As Justice Jackson put it in a judgment which Americans still love to cite, "No official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. If there are any circumstances which permit an exception, they do not now occur to us." So a lot of Americans are looking askance at what's currently happening in Europe, citing things like bans on veils and minarets as evidence that old Europe hasn't changed its intolerant spots. The US monitors freedom of religion worldwide as a litmus test of countries' wider commitment to fundamental freedoms. In Europe, on the other hand, there are people who see things quite differently. For them, religion is not the friend, but the enemy of freedom. They may cite things like the fatwa against Salman Rushdie, the murder of Theo van Gogh, the violent protests at the Danish cartoons, and Christian attitudes to homosexuality as evidence of its essential intolerance. From that point of view, it's secularism, not religion, that's now the guardian and guarantor of freedom of expression. And this has led to a pushing of the boundaries of what's acceptable to religious people, particularly through the production of provocative art, drama, and literature. Some see this as a kind of purge that's necessary to keep the arteries of free expression open. Thus and so, the disputes between the religious and the secular have escalated, and the battle lines between them have hardened recently. And into this febrile atmosphere comes EU equality law. Progressively adopted by the UK from 2003 till now, this extends protection against discrimination on the existing grounds of gender and race to the new ones of also of disability, age, sexual orientation, and religion. And this is backed up by the new Equality and Human Rights Commission established in 2007. The intention is, of course, honourable. Being religious can result in unfair treatment, and greater protection seems desirable. There have already been some cases, such as Noah versus Desrosiers in 2008, in which individuals have fought and won cases against those who have discriminated against them, directly or indirectly, because of their religion. But far more publicity has been given to a string of cases in which religion seems to have been the loser. And it's Christians, not Muslims, who've been centre stage, and whose rights to wear crucifixes, to pray, or discriminate against gay people have not been protected in the perception. And 4 of these cases have now been taken up to the European Court of Human Rights, backed by new campaigning groups like Christian Voice and Christian Concern, and we're still waiting for the outcome of that. So what seems to have happened is that equalities law, far from resolving disputes over religion, has become a stage on which they're currently being played out, particularly by the most extreme fringes of religious and secular opinion, in full public view. And I do think that's an important point, because there's a very large middle ground of religious and secular opinion, which is in danger of being entirely excluded from these debates at the moment. So that's the background to where we are now. It's an area in which there's been a vast explosion of research in recent years. I've written 2 reports for the Equality and Human Rights Commission, just doing a literature review and a summary of some of the main themes coming out of that research, and there is an enormous amount. They're publicly available if you're interested in seeing the research that's been going on. And we're fortunate to have 2 academics with us who've been fully immersed in that work and contributed to that work, and we're going to hear from them first. And it's my pleasure to introduce Peter Jones, who is Emeritus Professor of Political Philosophy at Newcastle University. Peter.
Thanks, Linda. Well, my task is to talk about freedom of expression in relation to religion. Now, that's an issue I've worked on for many years, initially in relation to the now defunct blasphemy law, and then later, of course, in relation to the Rushdie affair. I convened a workshop for the Religion Society programme on the role of faith, the role of the state in a multi-faith society, and that greatly helped to clarify my thinking on this, and I hope other people as well. Now, if we set aside incitement to violence, should people be free to say whatever they like about the religious beliefs and practices of others? In recent years, as Linda said, this issue has pitted secular people who champion freedom of expression, including the freedom to ridicule and to mock, against religious people who in various ways want to curb expression. Now, the battle lines haven't always been drawn in that way. Historically, freedom of religion has been closely associated with freedom of expression, since freedom to express and propagate religious beliefs is essential to religious liberty. Nowadays, of course, the religious still do often speak up for free expression. For example, some religious groups were vocal critics of the Labour government's unamended bill to outlaw religious hatred, and I think they were rightly critical. But the religious have nowadays become more commonly associated with curbs on expression. Consider, for example, the protests evoked by the Danish cartoons, or Jerry Springer the opera, the play Beshti, Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ, and, of course, most of all, Rushdie's Satanic Verses. Now, I want to propose an approach which upholds free expression and dismisses complaints about offensiveness. John Stuart Mill was right to argue that freedom of thought and discussion is essential for the pursuit of truth and knowledge, and therefore a freedom we should guard jealously. But I also want to suggest that we have reason to curb our expression out of respect for others, especially when the expression cannot claim Mill's defence. Now, complaints of offensiveness are ubiquitous nowadays, so why should that not be our concern? Well, 3 reasons. First, offence is too easy, too undiscriminating. It offends me is little different from I don't like it. And so we end up effectively saying, you must not say it because I don't like it. And that, of course, is a wholly inadequate reason. Secondly, people take offence as well as give it. And in that respect, being offended is not like being punched on the nose. We can ask whether people reasonably take offence and dismiss their offence if they take it unreasonably. In particular, we should not accept that if people make a great deal of noise and resort to rioting, burning and killing, their response reliably indicates the offence they rightly feel and the degree of wrong they can reasonably complain about. Thirdly, offence suggests that what is objectionable about attacks on religious belief is the unpleasant mental states they cause believers to undergo. People are said to have offended feelings and offended sensibilities. In fact, believers are typically preoccupied by the wrongness of what is said or done, rather than by any unpleasant feeling they allegedly experience. And in that sense, their complaint is not self-centred. It's centred on wrongful treatment of what they hold sacred. And our focus should therefore be on what that wrong is, on why people don't like it, rather than upon merely that they don't like it. Now, that's not to argue that nothing should restrain the way we treat religious beliefs of others. But if offence doesn't provide that reason, what does? The answer I suggest is the respect we owe one another as human beings. It's widely accepted, especially in liberal societies, that respect requires us to recognise people's right to embrace whatever beliefs they find compelling and to live their lives in accordance with those beliefs. But if we take seriously the idea of respecting people as bearers of beliefs, we have reason to extend its implications to not subjecting their most cherished beliefs to vilification and ridicule. And here comes an important qualification: in the absence of overriding reason to the contrary. Now, that means giving weight to what others believe to be wrong just because they believe it to be wrong. And that is not the same as refraining from offence. Now, for upholders of free expression, this proposal may seem no less alarming than vetoing offensive speech. So let me add some reassuring comments. First, different beliefs are necessarily conflicting beliefs. They are necessarily critical of one another. So in a context of diverse beliefs, it makes no sense to demand that people should refrain from criticizing or attacking one another's beliefs. That is simply inescapable. Secondly, subjecting a belief to serious critical attention does not constitute disrespect for its holders, even though a critique may be far more corrosive of the belief than ridicule or irreverence. And thirdly, I have to add, some beliefs may be so absurd, so depraved, so outrageous, that we have no reason at all to be inhibited by claims of respect. Now, all of these considerations set tight limits to the demands of respect. Nothing should stand in the way of genuine critical inquiry and debate. Respect for people as believers should count for most when assaults on their beliefs are merely gratuitous. That is, when there is no serious purpose that justifies giving countervailing weight to what matters to other people. I don't pretend this is a simple matter. Nowadays, controversies in this area rarely arise from straightforwardly academic inquiry. As my earlier examples indicate, they arise much more often from artistic endeavours, high or low, and those cases require more nuanced judgment. But I see no alternative to judging them against the criteria I've suggested. Now, what are the practical implications of my position? Given the strong claims of free expression in this area, and the need for nuanced judgment, we should not seek to resolve this issue through law. Law is too clumsy an instrument. It creates too great a risk of things being silenced that ought not to be silenced. But our conduct shouldn't be governed only by law. We, and that includes the media, politician and satirist, we should consider whether respect for others' cherished beliefs should sometimes temper what we are legally free to say. Sometimes we have reason not to say something, even though we have a right to say it. Is my distinction between offence and respect a distinction without a difference, or at least without a practical difference? Well, consider the Danish cartoons and Jerry Springer the opera. It is clear which of these two evoked the loudest, most violent, most offended reaction. But objectively, did Christians not have at least as much to complain about in relation to the treatment of Christ in Jerry Springer the opera as Muslims had to claim about in relation to the treatment of Muhammad in the Danish cartoons? And did not the cartoonist have a clearer justifying purpose than did the composer of Jerry Springer? I ask you, imagine a version of Jerry Springer the opera in which everything remained the same except that Muhammad was substituted for Christ. Would we then have greater reason to object to the opera? Would the BBC then have reason not to screen it? Because sure as eggs they would not screen it. Offence might answer yes, we would have greater reason not to show that, but in my judgment, concerns about respect for people's beliefs doesn't actually justify that conclusion. I'm not in the same camp as George Carey, but I'm genuinely puzzled by why the common view seems to be that Jerry Springer was acceptable and the Danish cartoons were not. Now, I want to add a very brief postscript to this presentation. A few days ago, Boris Johnson banned a Christian group's advert destined for London's buses, which claimed that people could be post-gay, ex-gay and proud. Now, what was the reason he gave? It was that the advert was offensive and, moreover, intolerant. But intolerance consists in preventing, and I do not see what the advert would have prevented. And, of course, toleration itself entails putting up with what we disapprove of or dislike. We don't tolerate the unobjectionable because we've no occasion to tolerate it. A ban is necessarily intolerant. It may be justified, but its being justified doesn't make it not intolerant. And it should take more and better to justify a ban on speech than a tendentious claim that what is said is offensive. The more we all play the offensiveness game, the more toleration in general and free expression in particular will suffer, and the worse off we all shall be. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. And we'll go straight over now to Maleiha Malik. And Maleiha is Professor in Law at King's College, London.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. And what I wanted to address was the legal but also the political definition of religious freedom. One of the most important contributions of the Religion and Society programme that Linda oversees is that it's allowed a range of different scholars from different disciplines, such as history or anthropology or in the social sciences, to actually be able to study religion as an academic discipline. And I think this has been terribly important because there is still, especially in law, a sense in which religion is mystified. It's treated as a concept that is beyond rational academic analysis. And I think the really important contribution of the research that's been done is to really move us very quickly to be in a position where we can subject religion in society to a proper rational analysis using normal methods. And this is particularly important in relation to our subject today of religious freedom. Because more than any other human right, there's a common assumption, especially in the West, that religious freedom is a clear, conceptually stable, ahistorical, universal right that's available to everyone. But actually, if we look at the development of the concept, both legal and political, of the concept of religious freedom in the West, nothing could be further from the truth. Because if we look at the modern concept of religious liberty, for example, it has its origin in a complex history. Part of it emerges out of domestic struggles between different Christian denominations, both in Europe, especially the United Kingdom, and also in the United States. But religious freedom also always had an international aspect that fed through into the legal and the political definition. So, for example, the key moments when concepts of religious freedom were crystallizing into constitutional and human rights documents were also the moments when European missionaries in the 19th century were insisting on an assertion of religious liberty as part of the international politics of the era. And this was the crucial means that European missionaries had of securing the right to proselytize in colonized areas such as amongst the Coptic Christian community in Egypt or amongst Hindus, Sikhs and Muslims in British colonial India. And in case anyone thinks that that particular form of the use of religious freedom has ended, we actually have the International Religious Freedom Act passed in the United States in 1998 that aligns American foreign policy aims with the securing and opening up of different nation states to the politics of religious organization, American faith-based organizations having access to be able to enter into different states. And the work of anthropologists shows that Kyrgyzstan is a very good example of some of the implications of what happens when you have the use of religious freedom in that way. But actually what I want to focus on is the domestic debate. I want to focus on the cases that Linda mentioned. And it's quite apt because those cases yesterday, the European Court of Human Rights revealed that those cases will be heard on September the 4th at 9:30 a.m. for those of you who want to go and hear them live. And so what I want to do is address the UK debates. Here in the UK, debates about religious freedom are intensifying owing to a growing number of legal adjudications and cases that are coming before courts throughout the UK. Take the following examples of cases that have been lost by Christians in the UK courts in the last 4 years. Mrs. Liddell, a Christian registrar of marriages, argued that a requirement to conduct a same-sex civil ceremony was a breach of her right to freedom of religion, and it was religious discrimination against her at her place of work in Islington. She won in the first instance in the Industrial Tribunal, but she's lost in all the other UK courts, the Employment Appeals Tribunal and in the Court of Appeal. She's now appealed to the European Court of Human Rights, and that's one of the cases that will be heard on the 4th of September by the European Court of Human Rights. Second example, Christian employee of British Airways, Miss Ouida, claimed that the dress code of British Airways, which required personal ornaments to be concealed by the British Airways uniform, discriminated against her as a Christian because it did not allow her to wear a cross that was displayed in public. And that last bit is terribly important. British Airways said that she could wear the cross. Her point was that she wanted to prominently display the cross in public as part of her belief as a Christian. She lost that case. That case, again, is being appealed to the European Court of Human Rights, and that also will be heard on September the 4th. Mr. and Mrs. Bull were hotel owners who preferred to let their rooms to heterosexual married couples. They were held to have directly discriminated in terms of the provision of goods and services against a homosexual couple who were in a same-sex civil partnership. The Bulls case, the Bulls lost their case as well. So what I want to address in the rest of this is how should we approach these cases? I want to offer a personal view based on my study of the cases, and also I participated in one of the seminars that was funded by the Religion and Society programme that Peter coordinated. I want to suggest that the current framing of these cases in relation to the right to religious freedom, or in terms of equality and non-discrimination, has led us into a vicious impasse. The debate has very quickly collapsed into a clash of rights or a clash of equalities. So it's become my right of religious freedom or equality versus your right to equality on the grounds of sexual orientation. My own view, both as a lawyer but also personal view, is that the principle of tolerance does a lot more useful work in our analysis of these particular cases. Most crucially, I think, what we need to do is distinguish between speech and conduct, because those with strong religious beliefs about women or gays and lesbians can hold that belief or express that view. I think we should be absolutely clear about that, and we should actually protect their right to be able to hold that view and voice that view where it doesn't constitute harassment or a discriminatory act against women, gays or lesbians. So Miss Liddell and Mr. and Mrs. Bull can believe that same-sex civil partnerships are wrong or even evil. They can say so, and I think we should be more openly robust in our commitment to say they have the right to be able to hold that belief. But what they can't do is act on that belief to deny gays or lesbians who are registered in civil partnerships access to key services such as registration of their marriages or a bed and breakfast hotel. Now, it's often argued that there should be accommodation of the religious conscience of Mrs. Liddell or Mr. Bull, and there should be a wider exemption in equality law based on religion and belief. But we've already allowed some of the widest exemptions throughout the European Union to people like Miss Liddell or Mr. and Mrs. Bull to be able to discriminate against gays and lesbians. As a society, we've actually reached an agreement about what the limits of that exemption should be. It's represented by the Equality Act 2010. And if anything, I think, there's quite clear evidence that the Equality Act 2010 gives too wide an exemption to people like Miss Liddell and Mr. and Mrs. Bull. Now, it's sometimes argued, and I want to very briefly, before I end, address this point, that religion is like disability. So just as we adjust our public services for disability, we should accommodate Miss Liddell or Mr. and Mrs. Bull. But disability isn't like religion at all. Disability is a characteristic that's highly relevant to ensuring fair, just, and equal treatment. It's based on stable medical facts. Race, religion, and gender are characteristics we usually want to make irrelevant in decision-making when we provide goods and services. And absolutely crucially for my argument, disability does not, unlike religion, raise the risk that there's going to be an infringement of the human rights or the equality rights of groups such as women, gays, and lesbians. So let's return to Liddell and let me conclude. If equality for gays and lesbians and same-sex civil partnerships is a constitutional right, then it follows that Ms. Liddell is actually claiming an exemption from a general constitutional duty that the rest of us are subject to. Now, Parliament's already decided the scope of that. It's clear in the Equality Act. But should Islington Council be practical, be reasonable, and find another registrar to actually perform that marriage? I think the answer to that is no, for the following reasons. It would be a significant step backwards if, having won the fight for the right to same-sex civil partnerships, gay and lesbian couples could be shunned by the very public officials who we entrust to carry out key, important state functions and public services. Let me just move beyond the language of rights and move to the language, if you like, of asking you to develop some inner eyes and think about this issue. How would you feel if a public official was not willing to offer you a key public service? Most crucially, how would you feel if it was because of a key characteristic, such as because you were gay or lesbian? And I want to finish by saying that this harm would reverberate, I think, into the general culture of equality that we want to create in order to safeguard the rights of gays and lesbians in the society in which we live. So let me sum up in 2 sentences. In a WIDA, the dress codes or holiday dress codes case, accommodation doesn't have an impact on constitutional rights, but it's subject to balancing with other interests. So I think when the European Court of Human Rights hears that case, they may want to reconsider the judgment and take seriously her rights to be able to display a cross within reasonable limits of what's feasible for British Airways and their uniform code. But I believe that the Liddell judgment is correct law and it's correct politics. There should be no accommodation for the religious where the exemption is from a key constitutional or human rights or an equality value. Individuals, no individuals, whether they're Christians or Muslims or any other religious group, can expect to directly influence the provision of public services to the general public with their own personal, ad hoc religious beliefs, where that accommodation constitutes the breach of a constitutional right of another citizen. And I want to end with tolerance, as Peter did, because in extremis, tolerance can be enforced through human rights and equality law, but it's also a political and ethical virtue, and it's a matter for how we live outside the law. We should, if possible, I think, avoid the law. Non-legal solutions such as better organization of the workplace are good. But also, I think, back to speech and back to Peter's point. There's a joint interest in allowing a dialogue between religious people and gays and lesbians so that both sides can understand each other, challenge and reconsider what seem to be entrenched viewpoints. I think discussions of the type that we have in these cases, conflicts such as those between Liddell and Islington Council, between conservative religious people and gays and lesbians, should be hammered out through debate and compromise carried out in the public sphere, which is why I'm particularly glad that the Westminster Faith Debates have given me the opportunity to raise this topic today. Thanks.
I'd like to very much thank on behalf of all of us Peter and Maleiha for what I think are 2 absolutely excellent presentations. And amongst their virtues is they've illustrated the very great topicality of these issues, both in legal circles but also in wider societal circles. And so it's been extremely helpful. Peter mentioned the legislation, which was to do with incitement to hatred on grounds of religious belief, which in fact I was responsible for as Home Secretary. And
we didn't all agree.
A lot of people, particularly Liberal Democrats, didn't agree.
Quite so. I can remind you of an old letter he wrote.
And not to such an extent did people not agree that the House of Lords agreed a set of changes, which was then became, the House of Commons did not overrule it, the first defeat that the government had in the House of Commons in 2005 since 1997, only by 2 or 3 votes, but nevertheless significant. The organisation, and there are many organisations which can take credit for defeating the government at that time, but one of them is PEN, the organisation which speaks for freedom of literary expression. And the first of our distinguished respondents, Lisa Appignanesi, was formerly the president of PEN, which has been an extremely effective organisation in this field, standing up for freedoms in a whole variety of different ways, and she herself has played a very distinguished role in that. She's a writer herself. She's just, the most recent book is called All About Love, which in her own words, I think I've got this right, Lisa, is not much, but some religion is in the book, but I commend the book to you. Lisa, we're going to go to first, and thank you very much for being with us here this evening, Lisa, and we very much look forward to your response
well,
to
thank
the
you, Charles.
two papers.
It was great, with great fear, but then finally with great pleasure that we brought that delegation to you when you were Home Secretary at the Home Office. And I think the sense of writers actually standing up for free expression and championing a privilege which is, I have to say, very old in Britain, and certainly as old as, or older than freedom of expression. And this is the, if you like, the right to spoof, to ridicule, to make fun, to debate, to argue. When Geoffrey Chaucer, before Shakespeare, in his Pardoner's Tale, wrote, if you like, a rather critical view of religion, that was allowed. It was fine, and a very funny book it is too. And I'm glad to say that with the help of the Liberal Democrats, we managed to put this extraordinary amendment into the British statute books. And I think I'll just read it to you because I think, to me, it is one of the most important defenses of free expression anywhere. I mean, people keep talking about the fact that we don't have a British constitution, blah, blah, blah. But we do have this on the statute books, and I think people forget it's there. So I'm just going to read it to you. This is the amendment to the Religious Hatred Act, and it reads, I can't redo the whole thing, but I'll start. Nothing in Part 3 of the Public Order Act 1986 shall be read or given effect in a way which prohibits or restricts discussion, criticism, or expressions of antipathy or dislike or ridicule of particular religions or the beliefs or practices of their adherents, or of any other belief system or the beliefs or practices of its adherents, or proselytizing one's own religion or belief system, or urging adherents of a different religion or belief system to cease practicing theirs. In other words, it's a very full endorsement of free expression, not written in the kind of prose that I like, but nonetheless very, very important. So having said that, I should tell you a little bit about myself because I think it'll explain my position and why I find myself in almost total agreement with our academic speakers, and who I think have described the terrain extremely well. You know that I'm a writer, and I've long been a writer, but I grew up in the province of Quebec in Canada, which was, at the time that I grew up, I'm very old, a very Catholic enclave, in which the church really ruled the land, and indeed, as I learned as I grew up, also owned much of the land. And because of the various things that took place in that province and have taken place subsequently in my life, I'm always very interested to see when religion comes forward into the public sphere, whether we're actually talking about faith, or indeed offence, or whether we're making a declaration of power. In other words, we're playing politics. I was around during the Satanic Verses first book burning, then the Ayatollah's fatwa on Salman Rushdie, and indeed put a book together on the various stages of that affair with the very religious writer Sarah Maitland, very high church. We put this book together and not knowing what we would find, except that we were horrified and shocked by what had happened to one of our fellow writers. But what it became clear had happened was that this was not just a question of Muslims in Bradford feeling offended by a book they had never read, and a rather difficult book, I should say, but rather it was a question of a communitarian politics in India between the Muslims and the Hindus, which had made their way at that point by fax. We didn't yet have iPad and email and things happening very much more quickly as they do now. But in fact, it was a direct political manifestation in which religion was being used for political ends. And I think in a great many of the court cases that have been cited here today, in a great many of the court cases that were threatened around Jerry Springer, the opera, and indeed one of the reasons we feared the enactment of religious hatred legislation in this country was that the courts and offence, so-called religious offence, are used by political power seekers. In other words, American Christian groups who are very good at using the courts and litigation and teach people how to use it around the world to further the wishes, the desires, the beliefs of their particular sect, and finance these court cases, are usually in play in one way or another. And Britain, I fear, has learned a great deal from America latterly in this respect. And it's something we should all watch out for. I don't think it has to do with religion as such. So, second point. For me, faith is fine, and religion has provided a great deal of good in the world. It's provided community, it's provided art, it's provided for many people a kind of backbone of morality. But religion, if you're a historian as I am, has also produced a great many of the greatest wars in history, and continues to be used by rather militant forces, whether George Bush or Islamic, to say we are right and this is the only way to be right. I think in a plural society, and in most of Europe now, we live in plural societies, the best place for the state to be is totally separate from religion. And indeed, I would go out on a limb and say that although I like the category of respect, and I myself am always very respectful of the people that I meet, I think in public fora it would be ridiculous to demand respect of belief. Beliefs are systems of ideas. And one doesn't want to treat them particularly with any more piety than you would treat any other system of ideas. I mean, if I said to you, Marx said blah, 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 I wouldn't expect you to treat what I say with particular aura of piety. I would expect you to argue with me. And I think the same needs to be in place for religions. After all, there are a great many. Now, my last point, I won't go on for very long. I'm a woman. I think some of you may have noticed this. Religions have not, on the whole, been none of them have been, not on the whole, very kind to women. They have not given women much power. They certainly don't give them much autonomy or authority over their own bodies and over their own choices. And this is something that I cannot forget. And therefore, I do want to be able always to have religious freedom trumped by free expression, because I want to be able to challenge what is said to me about the uses of myself, my body. And therefore, I can't always treat everybody with the kind of pious respect that religions quite often demand of one in the public sphere. That doesn't mean that I don't respect you as an individual and that I don't, I can agree or disagree with what you say after a long argument, but there we are. That's how I feel we should treat things. And I do worry about the kind of litigation that we have now going into Europe over homosexuality and faith. I don't feel this is particularly useful, just in the way that was said before, simply because we will end up in a place where more and more of our very valued freedoms will be eroded as we are pious in our relationship to faith.
Lisa, thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely excellent and very, very clear. Thank you for setting it out so clearly. And I do pay respect, by the way, to Penn for the discussion of the issue when we talked about it. It's interesting, our legislation was about incitement to hatred, and I was interested that Peter in his presentation excluded at the beginning incitement to violence, and you've got an interesting area. Where does hatred fit in violence and so on? It indicates the difficulty of handling these debates. And I'm particularly delighted to introduce Bishop Michael Nazir-Ali, the former Bishop of Rochford. He has been, throughout his time as a very senior cleric, an absolutely clear and courageous exponent of a set of views which have not always been fashionable, I think it's fair to say, but many, especially with Home Secretaries, but then there are a lot of people whose views aren't fashionable with Home Secretaries, I regret to say. But many people have said, and the reason we were very keen to ask you, and we're delighted that you were ready to come, is that you have addressed these issues with a clarity and a sincerity which is absolutely outstanding. And we are really delighted, Bishop Michael, that you've agreed to come this evening and join our debate, and we all look forward very much to what you have to say.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very grateful to Dr. Jones and to Professor Malik for setting out their positions so fully. There is much to agree with and to admire in what they say, but of necessity, you'll appreciate I will concentrate on where I have questions or where I disagree. I'm not sure that Professor Malik's examples that she's given are the most characteristic. What about Sheila Matthews, the pediatrician, excluded from an adoption panel because of her Christian faith, Andrew McClintock, the magistrate, or Gary McFarlane, the relate counsellor? Or, in fact, whether she has stated the questions accurately about the cases she has considered. Take Miss Aweda, for instance. The point is that people of other faiths are allowed by British Airways to wear the religious symbols publicly, such as the hijab or the kara. It is only Christians who are not allowed to wear the cross. That's the point there. Similarly, with the Liddell case, as I understand it, it was the employers who appealed against her after she had won in the initial determination. So much for exhortations to dialogue and to non-adversarial solutions to these problems. We must, of course, seek such solutions, but it takes two to tango. With the Bulls also, the men were not denied access to bed and breakfast, but to a certain kind of accommodation which the Bulls provided only for married couples. Now, we may disagree with the Bulls on this, but we must record what happened accurately. Professor Malik, I think, is in danger of confusing equality of persons with equal regard for behavior and lifestyles of different kinds. In other words, of reifying behavior or lifestyle as if they attracted the same kind of rights as persons. Whether we have in fact reached a balance between religious freedom and equality for sexual preferences is precisely the question facing us. It has definitely not been settled, as it appears Professor Malik believes. Race and gender are distinct issues, and we should not confuse them here with sexual preference. Her position struck me as a kind of ultra-Benthamite legal positivism, to be expected in a lawyer, I suppose. The law must be obeyed simply because it is the law. In this, she ignores the legal and moral tradition set out, for example, by Bentham's contemporary Sir William Blackstone, recognized even by Baroness Warnock, that morality transcends law, and that sometimes law has to be revisited in the name of morality and, we might say, I would say, belief. There is little recognition in her paper of traditions like moral realism, how things are and how they best function, the natural law tradition, and perceptions of the common good. Nor is there any acknowledgement of the ways in which moral codes have generally emerged from religious traditions. In our own society, of course, the pervasive influence of the Ten Commandments in both law and morality. She does not refer to the long-standing custom in this country of respecting conscience, especially where it has been formed in a reputable moral tradition, as in conscientious objection during war, or even in the workings of the Abortion Act of 1967. Such respect has largely been overturned in the recent equality legislation. Why? Legal positivism can lead to totalitarianism and to a tyranny of the majority. It will not lead to, generally speaking, to a balancing of the rights which we need today. Most conflicts, by the way, in the last 100 years or so have been caused by totalitarian secular ideologies and not by religion. I can count them out if you wish. Reasonable accommodation of religious belief at the workplace is a well-developed legal doctrine arising out of the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States and from civil rights legislation, funnily enough. One American judge has been quoted, another has said, "It is part," I quote, "of our happy tradition of avoiding unnecessary clashes with the dictates of conscience." If such a doctrine had been in place in this country, we would have avoided many of the unhappy instances provided by Professor Malik. Miss Liddell, for example, could easily have been accommodated because there were other registrars to deliver the service required by the law, and no one would have been denied a service or felt slighted. The law mandates a service to be provided, not necessarily who provides it. It would be good to know if Professor Malik agrees with Andrew Kopelman, whom she cites in her paper in this regard, or whether she wishes to stay with her Benthamite conclusion. Can she have it both ways, is my question. Where Dr. Jones is concerned, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights provides for an exception to free speech not only where there is an incitement to violence, but also to discrimination against an individual or a group. Thank you. That is, I think, as far as we should go. There is no room, for example, for laws preventing defamation of religion, as some people have been campaigning for. As to the role of the religious in promoting freedom, I'm speaking now to Dr. Jones's paper, it would have been good, for me anyway, to have seen some reference, for example, to the Reformation's insistence on the availability of the Bible for all. I mean, that was a great step forward in religious freedom in this country. Evangelical support for Roman Catholic emancipation in the 19th century, and the Second Vatican Council's landmark declaration on religious liberty, Dignitatis Humanae. The ways in which secular and religious groups work together to limit the scope of the hate speech legislation is also worth noting in this regard. I agree that the presumption for freedom of expression should remain. That is the basis for a free society, after all. Such freedom, however, is not absolute, and I agree with Professor Jones that it needs to be tempered both by a passion for truth and a respect for our fellow citizens and what is most dear to them, even when we disagree with them. Whilst there must be freedom for rigorous criticism and debate, this cannot be a license for gratuitous, I underline, gratuitous offense. Such a dual commitment is vital if we are to live in a free, interdependent, and harmonious society. I look forward, Mr. Chairman, to further discussion of these issues raised by our distinguished presenters and by this response, of course. Thank you.
Bishop Michael, thank you very, very much for that response. I think it helps give the substance to the discussion when we go to the floor to see the various differences and differences of approach set out so clearly, and you've done it very clearly. Thank you very much indeed. Our final respondent is Rabbi Julia Neuberger. She is a legislator, a member of the House of Lords. She's made it clear that she's now a crossbencher and not, as I had thought, a Lib Dem. She used to be Lib Dem. She said, can discuss later, and I'm looking forward to that discussion later as to what path led you from being a Lib Dem to a crossbencher. I can think of lots of very good reasons in recent political history. We were contemporaries at university, and I've known Julia, therefore, for a very long time. She's now serving rabbi in the West London Synagogue, and she's very well known for her expressions of participation in national debate on this vast range of issues. Julia, we're so delighted you've agreed to come today and to participate and help in the response, and we're very much looking forward to what you're going to say.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And I could actually just start by saying I agree with both of our academic presenters and could leave it at that. But that would be very un-Jewish. We always go on forever, bang on for ages and ages. I also ought to say, I think perhaps to Lisa, who I also know reasonably well, that not all branches of all religions have discriminated against women. And I now preside as the senior rabbi at West London Synagogue, where we have 3 female rabbis and 1 openly gay male rabbi, and that's the team. Our student rabbi is male and straight. We don't know what to do with him, really. So let me start by making a substantive point here. It seems to me that as soon as we really start getting the law into what is and what is not permitted in terms of religious freedom of expression, we have in some quite important way failed. And I think that that's the issue. I think the question about respect, which I don't believe means piety. I don't think you have to be pious in respect. Respect means listening with respect. I think that respect and hearing quietly and all of those things are actually enormously important public virtues that we don't really value enough. I also speak as a Jew who doesn't wear any kind of marker. I don't wear a Star of David. My colleague David does wear a skull cap all the time, wherever he goes, including into all of our neighbouring Lebanese restaurants, where everybody's well used to us all, and they all just say, hello, Rabbi. And if it's Saturday, when we go in, they say, Shabbat Shalom, Rabbi, which I do find disconcerting but delightful. I don't really want to wear any kind of marker. I wouldn't want, as Michael does, to wear a marker of who I am. I don't want to dress differently because I am a rabbi, but my colleague David does want to dress differently because he's a Jew, and I defend his right to do so. But the really important thing about that is I can't see really why anybody should object. So where does that leave us in a multi-faith, if not multicultural society? Angela Merkel in Germany told us just under 2 years ago that attempts to build a multicultural society in Germany have utterly failed. Nicolas Sarkozy last year declared multiculturalism a failure in France and took issue with Muslims praying on the streets. Our present Prime Minister, David Cameron, has attacked state multiculturalism and wants to go for some sense of national identity. But what does that national identity mean for religious groupings? We're not all Church of England. What difference does it make to national identity were I to wear a Star of David, my colleague a skull cap, and my extremely orthodox co-religionist's 18th century court dress, and in the case of married women, either a wig or a scarf? Why should this cause anyone any disquiet or not be tolerated? And why have the French forbidden the public wearing of religious symbols? It doesn't, in any real sense, make sense to me. And I completely agree with you, Bishop, about British Airways, and I very much hope, and it will be very interesting to see what does happen in the European Court of Human Rights. I very much hope that that is going to be, the Ueda case will be re-examined, and I hope that they will take a different view. It does seem to me there's an issue about reasonableness. If Mrs. Ueda was to wear an absolutely enormous socking great cross that was kind of, waved in front of people as they checked, like yours, like yours, yeah. As they checked in, yes, exactly. As they checked in, I can see an objection. But if she's to wear a normal, small, little gold cross around her neck, what's the big deal here? And I think that there is something here about the reasonableness test and the tolerance test. And I do think tolerance, or perhaps more properly, toleration, is something that we should be thinking of very seriously here. And I really do think that the United States, in the 60s, really coming out of the race segregation movement, the abolition of race segregation movement, had a lot to teach us. And I was a great sort of student of Roy Jenkins, he was Labour at the time, so I just want to make that point, who said something I think really important about this. He said, I define integration, therefore, not as a flattening process of assimilation, but as equal opportunity accompanied by cultural diversity in an atmosphere of mutual tolerance. That's the goal. We may fall a little short of its full attainment, as have other communities both in the past and in the present. But if we are to maintain any sort of world reputation for civilized living and social cohesion, we must get far nearer to its achievement than is the case today. And I agree, I think that's right. But of course, in the 60s, religious identity wasn't part of Roy's thinking. Now it would have to be. And that's compounded by people's images in their brain of terrorist outrages which they see as being committed by fanatics in the name of Islam or Christianity or Judaism or Sikhism or whatever. Now, it does seem to me that public authorities have a duty to enforce the law. So what do we believe in this country? We believe that the subjection of girls or women, child marriage, forced marriage, honour killings are simply not acceptable in our society, and we shouldn't allow them. We've got legislation, and it's founded on principles of equality, that prohibits them. So the Forced Marriage Act, and, there is then an issue about whether public officials, that's politicians and civil servants and public servants in local authorities, should be turning a blind eye to any of this. And I think that there is a real question about the extent to which, as a society, we should be expecting our public servants to take on these issues that we've decided as a society properly. And I don't really feel that we always do. I was shocked, I don't know how many other people were, I was shocked when there was all the row over Beshti, the play, when no minister condemned the people who were protesting against the play. It seemed to me that what that seemed to suggest from, if you like, people who are our leaders was an equal respect for the protesters' free speech in protesting as the free speech of the artists. And I think that there's something that we need to tease out quite strongly here. Now, I was going to quote the Penn Clause, but I'm not going to do so. So what do I think that leaves us with? I think it leaves us with being free to be critical, free to proselytize, and I say that as a Jew, and we don't proselytize. We make it jolly difficult to convert to Judaism, even for people who want to, and I hate proselytizing. Nevertheless, I believe we should be free to proselytize. I think we should be free to be moderately offensive. The difficulty is going to be deciding about who decides what's moderate. But Peter Jones is absolutely right about the nature of offensiveness. It's quite difficult, because I'm offended doesn't mean you shouldn't say it. But I do think it also means a respect for tolerance, a desire not to offend unnecessarily, and I don't think all artists hold to that, a desire for courtesy and politeness, which I think has gone very largely in our society, and the willingness to allow and encourage civilized debate, such as this is. It should also, I think, mean not allowing the breaking of the law. And that's, I think, why one has to say the law was engendered as a result of civilized debate within our legislature, and that is why it is not legitimate for people like the Bulls to say they're not prepared to host a homosexual couple in a... Well, but that's what they were implying. We'll come back to that. But I do believe that the wearing of symbols should be allowed. So where do we end? I think we end with a desire for civilized debate, a desire to speak freely but courteously, and I think we should not allow the breaking of the law once the law has been debated and agreed. You can campaign to change the law, but whilst the law is there, I don't believe we should allow the breaking of it. So Peter Jones is right. I think we need to move towards respect. Respect at the moment has rather a bad name because of the political party in its name. But nevertheless, I think the term is absolutely the right one. Don't vilify or ridicule unless there's a good or overriding reason. And I think that means a bit of self-limitation, not necessarily always going to the law.
Thank you very much indeed, Julie. Actually, the respect I like is not, with all respect to him, George Galloway, but Linford Christie, who set up an organisation, Enough Respect, and he was campaigning for the idea of respect. And I think it's a very interesting idea to think, what do you mean by respect and what is moderate? Okay, we've now got about 25 to 30 minutes where I'm going to throw it open to the floor. We have colleagues with microphones around who will who will come to you when you indicate. I'm going to take the questions or comments firstly in threes and ask people to say their names and/or organisations when they speak, and I shall then ask the panel to respond. I'm not going to ask all the panel to respond to all the questions which are raised, and ask everybody, including the questioners, to exercise some self-discipline, given the relatively limited amount of time we have at our disposal. So can I see indications of the first one? I'll take the gentleman at the back over there, the woman at the back over there, the gentleman in the front right here, and then I will come around again.
My name is Nick Spencer. I'm Research Director at Theos. I want to add my thanks to the panel for 5 very interesting contributions and offer a very quick example as a provocation, picking up on some of the points that Maleiha in particular made. A number of years ago, Ogilvy and Mather, the advertising agency in America, won a contract from the Catholic Bishops' Conference there to do some advertising work. A number of female employees refused to work on it because they had a moral objection to the Catholic Bishops' Conference, and Ogilvy and Mather allowed them not to work on it. When I worked in a similar industry in London a number of years ago, the company I worked for had made a corporate decision to work for tobacco companies and to work for gambling companies, but it did not force its employees to work in those on those jobs. It paid their salaries, but it gave them some accommodation. Now, that is obviously a model drawn from the corporate sphere, but I want to know the panel's view on why that isn't an acceptable model of reasonable accommodation, paying attention to people's conscience in the public sphere.
Thank you. The lady at the back.
Rose Hudson-Wilkin, a priest in Hackney and also in the House, in the Palace of Westminster. I just wanted to say very quickly that I live and work in a place that is extremely multi-ethnic, and where multiculturalism is alive and well and working and real. We don't talk about it. We don't go around holding seminars to say whether or not we should be allowed to communicate because we are from different backgrounds, religious backgrounds, etc. We just simply recognize and respect the fact that we're human beings from various traditions. And again, also, we don't try to proselytize within that. We respect each other and make it real. And I think part of the problem is we have a group in society that has decided what normality is, and then decides we don't want you to be a part of this normality because you're different.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take a couple more before I come to the questions than the first three. So if a couple of other people can indicate, I'll take a couple more before coming to the panel. But this gentleman's next.
Hello, yes. My name's Darren Newman, and I'm an employment lawyer, I guess, of sorts. I write and train on the subject. And I've spent about 20 years reading, talking, writing about employment law. So it's a subject that's very close to my heart. And I'm quite distressed at the extent to which my subject has been hijacked by a political debate and is being used as a proxy for a completely different argument. And I think the point that was made earlier, that there is a sort of American technique of political litigation to bring a claim in order to make a political point, is a very valid one. And all of the 4 cases that have been brought to the European Court of Human Rights, the McFarlane, Ladaley, Awada and Chaplin, are cases that have been brought purely because of the political drive that is going behind those cases. And it's a real plea, really, that can we just try and step away from discrimination law, because that's a very technical thing, and discrimination law works in a particular way, and those cases are actually not about a clash of rights. They're not about whether it's a good thing for British Airways to have a very strict uniform code that stops people wearing a cross. It's about whether doing that meets certain legal tests about whether it's direct or indirect discrimination. And we're not going to move this debate forward very much about the place of religion in public if we just keep getting our discrimination law wrong, which is, I'm afraid, what tends to happen.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm now going to take another group of 3. Gentlemen next to you, first of all.
My name is David Pollock. I'm President of the European Humanist Federation. I would like to pick up something that Lisa Appignanesi said. She mentioned it in the context of Quebec, that in her youth there, the church ran the place in an informal way, but a powerful way. And that is true of large parts of Europe as well, with the Catholic Church. And it's true of the way the Catholic Church does politics in the United Nations, in international assemblies, in a very powerful way against women's rights, against reproductive and sexual health rights. And it is not observed in this country. But if you go into international forums, you will find that it is a fact of life that people skirt round the whole time. And when they demand respect for their right to do this, that is a real worry. And the American example is not one that we need to follow in this country. The recent case in the Supreme Court, the name of which I can't remember except it had the word Tabor in it, which established that any religious employer has the right to ignore employment legislation, to ignore the rights of employees if they breach any sort of little religious code, is something that we have the beginnings of in this country, with exemptions for religious employers. And remember, religious employers include 1/3 of all our schools. We don't want to go down that way.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the gentleman there in the front row. If you could just take the mic there, and then I'm going to go to the lady over there. So, gentleman there.
Thank you, and thank you to all of our distinguished panellists. I think
Could you just give your name, please?
My name is Rahim Jung. I'm a social worker and a freelance journalist. I think the primacy of tolerance is clear in what everybody was saying, but I think that there was an implication, certainly in the academic speakers earlier, that the threat in terms of tolerance seems to be coming from the religious to the secular. As a religious person, the shoe certainly seems to be on the other foot. If I look at the situation in Europe at the moment, with the banning of headscarves, with the banning of minarets, with now even here in the UK with some religious literature, classic religious literature, which has been around for a long time, I can walk into a bookshop and buy a copy of Mein Kampf, but I can't buy a copy of classic Arabic literature, which has some political connotations to it now. It seems to me that, as I said, the shoe certainly seems to be on the other foot.
Thank you very much. And finally, before the panel, the lady there. Lady just there. Thank you.
Abigail Fryman, The Tablet. Question really to Peter Jones. You say that some beliefs are so absurd, depraved and outrageous and so on that we have no reason to be inhibited by a claim to respect them. Is the problem not how you determine what makes a belief outrageous? Because surely views which 50 years ago, for example, would have found homosexuality not so socially acceptable, obviously that has seen a huge swing of opinion. So how do we determine which beliefs are outrageous? Because obviously other groups in society have different views based on culture, ethnicity and so on. So what yardstick can we use in one society?
Thank you. I'm going to go first to Maleiha, as a lot of the questions were about law, and then to Lisa, and then I'm going to ask other members of the panel if they'd like to contribute. Maleiha.
Yeah, but perhaps I could address the first question. I mean, as someone whose main research interest is discrimination law, I've now spent over half my life working on the subject, mainly employment discrimination. I couldn't agree with you more that actually what we've got going on in terms of equality legislation and the litigation around this is really distorting, I think, and actually I think it's causing a downward pressure on religious freedom and the rights of religious people in the workplace. Because the politics behind these cases, I mean, I think all of these litigants have the right to bring these cases, and I think very often, litigants are difficult. The sort of people who litigate all the way to the Court of Appeal aren't the sort of people who put their feet up and watch EastEnders at 7 o'clock. So it's always difficult with litigants who want to go all the way. But the politics behind these cases is particularly pernicious. On Sunday evening, an organisation that researches far-right activity released a report. They're an organisation called Hope Not Hate. They track through the way in which far-right groups in the United States and in the United Kingdom are really developing this really toxic politics where a lot of the organisations that have been supporting people like Miss Liddell, are actually implicated in having links with homophobic and Islamophobic organisations in the United States that are involved in anti-Muslim, anti-gay and lesbian, sort of extreme wing of the Tea Party movement type of politics. And I think that some of the media coverage of these cases kind of represents this as, oh, it's just an individual case. Yes, it's an individual case, but I think if there is anyone from the media here, we need a lot more investigative journalism of the politics and the individuals behind these cases who are converging in this really awful far-right, homophobic, Islamophobic discourse that is hijacking really legitimate forms of religion within Britain, and something, as Lisa said, that's quite alien, I think, to British religious formation. On the second point, which is about reasonable accommodation, which is Nick's point, all I would say very briefly, Nick, the whole tenor of my paper is you can have religious accommodation up to the point at which you are interfering with the human rights or equality rights of someone else. We treat equality and human rights as the way in which we organise our public life. We don't take the 10 Commandments or natural law theory as our guide to the way in which we treat gays and lesbians anymore.
Thank you, Maleiha. Lisa, then I'm going to come to Bishop Michael, then to Peter, then to Julia. Lisa.
I'm afraid I missed the question from over there, from the tablet. So I'm a little bit hard of hearing at the moment.
Do you want to just repeat your point directly to Lisa?
Was it directed at me?
Yes, it was directed at you.
Sorry. Could you stand up so I can see your lips move?
Well, it was following on from a comment Peter made about whether we should give such accommodation to beliefs which are just obviously outrageous or absurd or very, very offensive. My question was, well, how do we determine then what constitutes an outrageous belief, given that public opinion can shift, and, for example, in the last 50 or even sort of 100 years, attitudes towards, for example, homosexuality have shifted hugely. So how do we create a yardstick by which to judge those kind of questions?
Thank you. Sorry to come back to you. I'll ask Peter in a second, but Lisa first.
I don't think this is something that is done by a single individual, and I certainly don't think it's done by laws which signal things. I think the way in which attitudes are created are by events like this. And people discuss with each other, they argue, books are written. Critics often disagree with the books that may be what you might call disrespectful or intolerant. I mean, one of the things that people always object to when writers come and say, yes, we want plurality of opinion, we want a lot of views, we want ridicule, we want satire, and so on, is that they think, well, they're far too powerful, they always get to say what they want to say. Well, in fact, books, first of all, go through a long process before they're published, as do newspaper articles, which you know very well. They're not accepted in their ordinary state, necessarily. And once they are out there in the public sphere, people talk back all the time. And the writers are indeed satirized, ridiculed, and so on, and the process goes on. So what I would say, what do I want to say about this? I mean, I'm not necessarily for the so-called respect agenda, but I would prefer the civility agenda, which means that you actually do notice that there are others in the world apart from yourself. Respect has a funny tendency, or rings strangely to me, simply because I'm sorry to harp back about when I first came to this country, because it's so long ago I should be used to it, but one of the things that struck me was that, wonderful Oxbridge dons, and I used to be an academic, would as soon as they said to me, with all due respect, Lisa, or with all due respect, Professor, and I learned it was the same in the corporate world, what they really wanted to do was to squash me into the ground. And they had absolutely no respect at all for what I had said, and they wanted to contravene it. So there's a way in which respect is one of these easy words. And I'd much rather giggle with someone than have them treat me with respect, or indeed with that kind of frigid tolerance, which makes you want to go and bury yourself in some very deep hole and never resurface. But that's so. Okay. What I do, if I have any kind of belief and if I have any faith in anything, it's the power of people to debate and argue and criticize and come out with something good at the end. And by that I don't mean hurling invective, although that may occasionally on a comic stage be part of it. Most people don't go around insulting each other. And the ridicule when we talk about cartoons. Well, cartoons are there for that purpose. That is their genre. One doesn't want to misread the genre, just in the way that I wouldn't misread the Koran and think it was necessarily a political tract by, I don't know, somebody, Charles Clarke.
Thanks. No, politicians don't involve themselves in this kind of behaviour, you'll be glad to know. Bishop Michael.
Yes, thank you. I think to the employment lawyer, the concern should be, as a nation, about morality, not the technicalities of law. I mean, we leave those to you, and you know them better than I do, certainly. But we cannot sacrifice moral concern for the freedom of a person at the bar of technical law. I mean, that's what I call legal positivism just now. In the past, in Britain, seeing as we are talking about the British tradition, in the past, inclusion of respect for conscience and reasonable accommodation was an aspect of lawmaking. I mean, I've given the Abortion Act of '67 as an example of this. Why was it not so with equality legislation? Why was there a departure from venerable tradition on this? Well, no, may I finish? I think you've had quite a lot.
Exemptions in the Equality Act for conscience.
I'm not going to let you, because I do want to get a response from everybody. I do want another round. So
may I just finish quickly? Yeah. Funding, by the way, is not a one-way street. I mean, who funded Hall and Preedy against Bull? It was the Equality Commission. The National Council of Civil Liberties, you're talking about the United States, has repeatedly taken religious groups to court for alleged discrimination. So this is not a one-way street, and may I plead for arguing on merit and not tarring people with various kinds of phobic brushes, whether it's Islamophobia or homophobia or Christianophobia, or whatever it might be. I mean, let's talk about the merits of the argument, please.
Thank you, Michael. Peter.
On the respect point, yes, I think what we want we're in a plural society. We want some kind of criteria we can all agree upon in spite of our different beliefs. And principles like respect and the hard principle and so on aspire to do that. But there is difficulty there. And that we might all agree we should show respect towards one another, but we might disagree on what respect itself requires. And therefore, I have to concede we're not going to agree on what kind of things are outrageous and contemptible. I mean, but I don't want to duck entirely for my own part. I think, for example, the belief that if you're a suicide bomber, you become a martyr, and you'll have 72 virgins at your disposal after your death, which seems to be both absurd and disgusting. I think literal creationism has arisen historically really quite recently. I'm afraid I'm rather Dawkinish on that. I think it's entirely reasonable for people who've got religious beliefs to take views on sexual conduct and to express the view that homosexuality or homosexual conduct is sinful and so on. However, there's that group in America, I'm sure you know, who the God Hates Faggots group, and who go around to attend the funerals of American servicemen who have been killed, holding up placards saying that's what you get for promoting faggots. So it's that kind of thing. But I do agree. I mean, that's precisely the kind of thing on which you're not going to get agreement. Can I say a little on the other issue? Nick, on your issue, what I think about that is that the employer will be quite right to say, well, yes, you've got your conscience, but I've got a job to be done, and so off you go, get a job elsewhere, which is the human rights law position on the whole. Yet, I think in the context of freedom of belief, on the whole, we have to bear the consequence of the cost of our own belief. And I'm very happy about people as well shifting costs onto other people. That happens a bit under discrimination law, but it is well contained, I think contained in the right kind of way. And I think that works both ways, both for people who have got conscientious beliefs objecting to, as assuming in this case, working for a contract for a religious group, and the other way around too. However, that's a matter of rights. What I do think there's scope for is for employers and so on to have discretion. And I mean, I do have some sympathy for Lillian Liddell. I think that on the general point, it was right she lost the case. But here was a woman who was in post when the job changed around her. And if she'd been given an exemption, there would have been no gay couple would have not got a civil partnership. Yeah. Now, Liberty intervened in that case and argued that not only were the council, did they have no obligation to accommodate her, they had an obligation not to accommodate her, and had they accommodated her in any way, that would have been illegal. And that was endorsed in the Court of Appeal. That seems to me a sad state of affairs. Because I agree with the gentleman here. There's always some people who want to push it, but I expect there's an awful lot of cases that get sorted out by common sense and reasonableness. And I think it's a sad state of affairs if the law prevents that.
Thank you, Peter. Julia.
Very briefly, first of all, because most of our points have been covered, first of all, to Rahim, I agree it goes both ways. And secondly, and this is a point to Lisa, about laws, that we don't get a change of opinion by laws. Actually, I'm not sure that's true. I wish I thought it was true, but I don't think it's true. And I want to give you one example which I think has been very powerful and has been an object lesson, I suppose, for me, looking at my children. And that is that, and Charles and I will both remember only too well the beginnings of sex discrimination legislation and race relations legislation in this country. And it started in 1969, effectively, and came through in 1975. My children were born in 1979 and 1981. By the time they were old enough to think in those terms, it was completely anathema to them that you should discriminate on gender or race grounds. Now, it wasn't because the law had, if you like, come into force, but that the law had begun to, if you like, encapsulate what had also been part of a debate. But the making of the law and the discussion around it was essential to change opinion. And I think that's a really, really important thing to think about as we think about freedom of expression. Because actually sometimes you want to limit freedom of expression because as a society, you decide that you want to change what it is acceptable to say. Now, I think that's where the debate lies, but I do think you need to recognise that law can do it.
Okay, I'm now going to take another group of 6. We've got a lot of people want to contribute, which I'm delighted about, but we're also very short of time. I'm going to take the person there in purple, the woman here, just find the front, the gentleman there right at the back, the woman there in the middle, the gentleman in the front here, and I'll take the gentleman there with the jacket there. So, who was first in that lot? The person here, just there.
And we've each got a minute.
And if you can all be very quick, please, with your question.
Thank you very much. I'm Rena Lewis from the London College of Fashion, where I'm running one of the projects in Linda's programme on modest fashion, modest dressing. I'm going to try and keep this brief because it's been
if you can.
terribly
Really,
interesting.
we've got so much interest. It's tremendous. But if you can,
I want to go back to a point that Linda made in her introduction about which groups and religions and organisations have taken centre stage in some of the recent controversies in this country, and also, therefore, which parts of the middle ground are disappearing, what types of opinion are being heard, and picking up on Lisa's excellent point about looking for where the power is happening. And I wonder whether what we're seeing here is not just a struggle between religions for rights and representation and protection, or indeed a struggle between religions and those groups that are taken now to be emblematic of the secular, most often groups concerned with sexuality, but also a struggle within religions. And then what's not really being articulated very clearly are those groups within different religions who feel misserved by the different groups or organisations, and increasingly well-funded campaigning organisations, who presume to speak in the name of Christianity, etc. Are we going to find, whilst it was pernicious after 9/11 and after 7/7, that British Muslims were increasingly asked to define themselves as moderate rather than extremist Muslims, are Christians going to have to do the same?
Okay. Now, there was a lady just in front of you there, that's right.
Thank you. Marianne Overton. I'm an independent local councillor, so I'm very pleased to see an independent crossbencher here today. I'm delighted. I would like to raise the issue about if politicians have made laws which make it not possible to discriminate or base decisions on religious beliefs, how is it that politicians are excluding the political prejudices, and they actually allow decisions to be made on political prejudices when you talk about promotion or allocation of jobs, and even when you're talking about whether the independent mayor can speak in the press or not? Thank you.
Okay. The gentleman there was one of the people. I can't remember all 6 immediately, but I will in a second. And then at the back, it's a gentleman on the central line. Sorry, just there first. Yeah, first there.
My name's Andrew Copson. I'm Chief Executive of the British Humanist Association. My question is a very specific one for Bishop Michael, and feeding off what Peter said earlier when he made the point that when it comes to conscientious objection, it's has been accepted for a long time that to some extent conscientious objectors bear some of the consequences of their objection. And that's true also, isn't it, in religion and belief. I would really love to be a vicar. I think it's a really nice sort of job. I think it'd be a very nice job for me. I like talking, I like writing, I like thinking, I like helping people. I'd be a rabbi. Actually, thanks. Well, you are a vicar. He says I'd be a good one. Okay. But you know what? I'm not a Christian and I'm not Jewish and I don't have those beliefs, so I can't be. Conscientious objectors in times of mass conscription have the right, often in other jurisdictions, to object, but face some sort of other sort of service instead, or some sort of penalty. It can't be your case, surely, that everyone is allowed untrammelled freedom of action in accordance with their beliefs and untrammelled conscientious objection. So we do need to draw a line somewhere, don't we?
Thank you. There's somebody right at the back there. Yep, gentleman there.
Yep, Paul Bickley from Theos. I wonder what the panel would say to a constructive distinction which could be made between kind of civil and social rights. It seems to me there are material distinctions between something like the Liddell case and the Bowlby and B case, where perhaps the Goods and Services Directive has just got a bit too far out of the bag. And what is the proper scope of the law? It seems public officials and their business is one thing, notwithstanding Peter's comments, which I think were fair, but what individuals who set up businesses and are kind of pursuing their own kind of life objectives do is another.
Thank you. Gentleman at the back there, the glasses. Mike's just coming over.
Yes, my name is Bjarne Nørum. I'm the UK correspondent for a Danish paper, not that one. Kristi Dagblad. Regarding the 4 cases at the court in Strasbourg, how much of they are fringe cases, and in terms of, it's not the established church, it's not Church of England, it's not the Catholic Church, but it is Christian concern and more fringe religious groups who are running those cases. So how much is that a reflection on the importance of those issues within the established church?
Thank you. The final one I recognised was the lady there, quite right.
I'm Baroness Berridge. I was a member of the inquiry called Clearing the Ground that Christian politicians put together to try and take some of the oxygen out of the debate that was happening mainly through the media. And we did come up with a recommendation for reasonable accommodation to be looked at and investigated, but we didn't thereby draw a comparison between religious belief as a protected characteristic and disability. But my question is that no one really here has touched on the issue to do with public order and the restriction on freedom of expression. I mean, particularly, I think Professor Woods, you know, we may want people to be able to absorb a deep degree of offence in a liberal democracy, but I think the reality is we're not living there. And so what are the constraints, and particularly in the amendments that were made on the religious hatred law, many of our police are trying to police this on the ground. So I would be grateful for some comments on where is the limit of freedom of expression when you hit public order as a value in society.
That's tremendous. I'll actually comment as a politician on a couple of the points that have been raised at the end, but I'm going to go to Julia, to Bishop Michael, to Peter, to Lisa, and then to Maleiha.
Right, I'm going to take the public order argument first, because I think actually that's one that perhaps I ought to talk about, and I'm sure that Charles will, but it does seem to me that that is one of the areas where you have to keep testing it out, and where the police, I think, are in quite a difficult position. In fact, I think that they would say, in many cases, they're almost in a nightmare position because they can't get it right, and they, on the ground, have to test it out. So I think that when we talk about freedom of expression, we have to say, and that's where I think you can't easily say that it's a self-limiting, because once you get a big group, it's quite hard to get it self-limiting, as we frequently see. There has to be a point at which you say the freedom of expression is limited by the disturbance that is being caused to others. But that is in a particular, and Charles can comment on it more, I should think, from experience, but in a particular case of where demonstrations of a particular kind cause havoc or great disturbance to others. And I think that that's where we need to limit it, and that's actually, I think, where the debate has largely gone. The only other one I want to comment on, apart from saying to Andrew Copson, I'm not sure that not having the beliefs has necessarily meant that you can't be a vicar or a rabbi, but that's a separate matter. It's true, though.
Is that only in your synagogue or more generally?
No, not by no means only in my synagogue. Absolutely, clearly, that is the case. I do want to say something about the civil and social rights point, which Paul Goodwin made, and it seems to me that I don't think we are very clear about the distinction between civil and social rights, partly because that isn't very well defined, I think, in UK law, although I stand to be corrected by Maleiha on that. But it does seem to me that there isn't a huge difference here between a public official representing, if you like, in some sense, the state. Therefore, I think having to go with the law, even though she didn't like it, agree with it, and it offended her, or give up the job, and actually people not wishing to give accommodation in a B&B to a couple in a civil partnership who wanted to sleep in a double bed and wanted to be treated equally with a married couple. And it seems to me that provision of goods and services, when you set up in business, you don't normally choose your clients. You're normally not entitled to choose your clients, actually, although sometimes one would say people do. Often professionals do, but normally running a business you're not entitled to choose your clients unless for particular reasons, and therefore I would say that those two have a certain amount of parallel in how they have to be regarded by the law.
Thank you, Julia. Bishop Michael?
Yes, I think to answer Andrew's question, very good question, I think the conscience issue is a British tradition, if you like, that conscience has been respected in terms of lawmaking, where it has been felt that a sizable number of people formed in a particular moral tradition would have difficulties with that law. And my question was, why was that ignored with recent equality legislation? Reasonable accommodation, on the other hand, is an American tradition. It is quite precisely stated, and if I remember this correctly, what the law says is that an employer or a service provider shall make provision for religious belief as long as this does not jeopardize the viability of the business or the service itself, or to put an undue burden on other employees. But given that, if you look at American case law, I mean, the extent to which this provision has been made is quite remarkable. I mean, I wouldn't want to go as far as that in this country. Even I wouldn't want to go as far as that. However, I mean, I think the other point that Andrew makes, if I could just make a quick comment on that, I think that those who are looking for a conscience provision, nurses, for example, in the NHS, on termination of a pregnancy, or the other cases that have been mentioned, should be prepared to take the consequences of such accommodation being made. With conscientious objection during war, the objectors had to do some pretty unpleasant things. Working unsocial hours, for instance, or working at pieces of work that are perhaps lower profile than they would otherwise. You know, I think those sorts of things can be discussed, certainly.
Thank you, Michael. Peter.
First, on public order, I agree with Julia that freedom of speech does not mean you have the right to demonstrate where you want, when you want, just as it does not entail everybody having the right to speak at the same time. On public order as a reason for limiting free expression, I can say on the one hand, on the other, I'm afraid. On the one hand, I'm deeply unhappy about that as a reason for silencing people, because what it means is a group's readiness to react violently and cause mayhem will then control the extent to which people can say things they dislike. So I'm very unhappy about, in a sense, passing a card to people to say, the more you react violently, the more you're able to silence others. On the other hand, of course, suppose I'm saying something here now I'm perfectly entitled to say, but you're a stroppy lot and you're about to cause a riot and life and limb is going to get hurt. Then I think it is the case the police have to intervene and silence me to prevent that happening, even though I have a right to say what I'm saying. I would simply characterise that as an unfortunate justified injustice.
Thank you very much. Justified injustice is a phrase we can return to a lot. Lisa.
Well, I think I agree with that. I think I do. But I wanted to take up what you had said, and it seems to me that there is a real sense that the religious voices that are loudest are the ones who do represent the extremes, and that, you know, if people of faith want the secular society as a whole to pay attention, from my point of view, it's much better to be the Archbishop of Canterbury or our dear lady here than it is to be an exorcist in a church, killing off little children because they happen to be inhabited by the devil. I mean, there's a real sense that the kind of ghoulish extremes take on the public voice, and the others who take on the public voice are the ones that are supported by power, if you like, financial power, and take cases through the courts. So, I don't know what one does about that. I'm not a believer of any kind, although I have nothing particularly against it. And it seems to me that if people want to have faith and still want all the goods that a plural and largely secular public sphere allows, then perhaps they should look to their own more religious extremists in their groups and say, actually, we do like being in this country with its plural traditions and its secular sphere, and it allows us to be rather noisier than we might have been able to be elsewhere, but we will nonetheless respect the laws and the I've used that word respect and I shouldn't have. We will be civil towards the laws.
It's allowed. Thank you very much, Lisa. Maleiha.
Yes, if I could just return to some of the themes I've presented on and just take on board some of the comments that have been made. I mean, I agree with Peter. I've got a lot of sympathy with Lillian Liddell. Actually, the judge in the Court of Appeal who had to say no to her, Mr. Lord Justice Neuberger, had a lot of sympathy for Lillian Liddell. I thought he might be related, actually, but had a lot of sympathy. He was deeply empathetic towards her. But, and this goes back to the point that Andrew Copson made, given a choice between who should bear the burden of conscience, should it be someone who has the constitutional right to be able to get services without discrimination, or should it be Lillian Liddell? I think it was a no-brainer, actually, for the Court of Appeal to have come up with the decision that they did. And the reason for that is the following. I think Liberty were right. We're not neutral about equality. We're not neutral about human rights. This isn't a matter of taste. These are the commitments in terms of constitutional values that we've made as a society. If you want a different morality, where you want to legislate on the basis of the Quran or the Ten Commandments, that's a different kind of constitutional structure. So I think the decision in Liddell is absolutely right. But I want to end on this point about religious freedom, which is the topic we're discussing. As I said at the start, religious freedom is an important right. It's a very important constitutional and human rights, and we need to give it some sort of stable content. But before we do that, we need to rescue it from some of the political toxic forces that I think at the moment are distorting it. I want to end with this report that I've just read, which makes hair-raising reading, the Hope Not Hate report. I don't think we should trivialize it by saying they're just, randomly accusing people of homophobia or Islamophobia. What we're talking about here is a serious convergence of political forces that are coming together in a really toxic constellation within United States. And, Richard Hofstadter, the historian, once famously said that the US has a very particular paranoid style of politics, which is domestically entrenched there. These forces that are bringing together certain forms of extremist Christianity with certain forms of objection to equality for gays and lesbians, with what's called the anti-Sharia movement and objection to Islam in the building of mosques, are coming together politically, and there are very important political links that are being formed with important organizations in the United Kingdom. So if, as I think all of us are, we're committed to religious freedom, one of the things we're going to have to do is to rescue religious freedom from people who neither care about freedom nor tolerance, and I think often don't even care very much about religion.
Thank you, Maleiha. I'm just going to make a very quick remark about the political points. One, just to say, in general, discrimination on the grounds of your political belief, for example, employment, is absolutely on the retreat. My grandfather was a teacher, a head teacher, and he was appointed by Durham County Council. The first question in his interview was, are you a Labour Party member? And that would not be legal today, and it simply doesn't happen. There are serious issues about the relationship between the political world and the employed world, but in general, I think most people would accept that discrimination on the grounds of your political belief is not an acceptable way of proceeding in employment matters. On just one point provoked by the question from the journalist from the Danish newspaper, I was very struck at the time of the Danish cartoons that no British newspaper, very much to my surprise, reprinted the cartoons. It was very, very striking. I would not normally have expected whoever, the Sun or whatever, to have expressed restraint in that area, but they did. And the fact is people do act more than people think in the conscience of the various issues about respect and so on that we've talked about. The final point on public order from Baroness Berridge is an extremely serious one. I was not sure whether I'd say this, but I remember very well when the play Behçti was being performed, I think in Birmingham, and I seriously considered, as Home Secretary, going to attend the play. And as I look back on it, I actually think I should have done that. I think it would have been a good thing to do. But the issue, Julia, as you made earlier, actually was a massive public order issue that was taking place at the time. And the Chief Constable of the West Midlands had taken a set of decisions about trying to preserve public order in the light of those circumstances. And I was too late to the decision. I think it's a mistake I made. But I think the point you make is absolutely well made. And in many of these issues, the public order issues are very, very substantial and real. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not justified to defend the rights of people to say what they have to say, but it does mean that exercising that right in a way that understands that environment is often difficult, particularly, and I conclude on the point a number of people have made, where there are a series of provocations and provocateurs whose specific motive is to provoke and to create either theatre or public disorder or whatever. And nobody can ignore the fact that that is the motive in the case of some people. They purport simply to be wanting to express their views, but the actuality is they want to provoke and operate, whether for the kind of motives Maleiha was just describing in relation to some organisations or in other areas. And I just think I'm very glad you raised the point, because there is an issue here which is very important. Now, we've run a quarter of an hour beyond where we meant to, but I really want to say, firstly, an apology to those of you I haven't been able to bring in, but secondly, an enormous thank you to the panel and to you for participating in what I think has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I think the way it's been done and the way people have contributed has been absolutely excellent. So thank you very much indeed. And I'd like to thank the panel for their participation this evening. Our sixth debate is in a fortnight's time on trends in religion and values. And I just want to ask Linda to say a word or two about that before we finally close this evening. Linda.
Well, Charles and my job here isn't to give our own opinions, it's to give a platform to other people, but he's just broken it, so I'm going to break it as well. I felt with the employment lawyer in this discussion, the frustration that you feel for me as a sociologist of religion, listening to the way people talk about religion. I spend my days looking and studying at what's happening to religion, and our public debates are massively out of kilter with what's actually happening to religion in Hackney or Burnley or Bushy or whatever. And that's a point that's come up again and again tonight. How far are our social representations of religion cut adrift from what's really happening? And that's exactly the topic that we're going to be looking at in our next debate in a fortnight. We're going to be looking at what's really happening to religion in Britain and has been happening over the last few decades. So I hope we'll see lots of you there. And thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you for coming. And just to say thank you again, come next time. There's a glass of wine afterwards for any of you who would like to participate, and we'll be around. Thank you very much for coming this evening.